We have a very special guest tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Marty White, from Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, Professor of International Studies and Sociology. And Marty has had an illustrious career working on grassroots social organisation and social change in China for the last quarter of a century. He's been directing survey projects in China to examine how ordinary citizens view the very high levels of income inequality. It's been our great pleasure at the China Journal to publish Marty's work, including some of his most recent survey work. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome Marty here along with a large group of eminent economists, sociologists, political scientists who are here for our annual CIW forum next week on the topic of inequality and common prosperity in China. We have an academic conference on the 19th and 20th next week, and that will be followed by a public panel discussion on the 20th of August, Wednesday 20th of August, from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. So if you're interested in this topic, I really encourage you to come along to that event. And that will not be here, that will be at the CIW auditorium. Just before I hand over to Marty, I'd like to pay my respects on behalf of the Centre and the University to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and a special welcome to any First Nations people attending tonight. So on that note, Marty, a big welcome. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. And some of you know, but let me mention that it's a very happy occasion. This is the 30th anniversary of my wife, Alice Hogan, and my first trip to Australia when I had a delightful sabbatical at ANU for half a year, thanks to John Unger and the Contemporary China Center. And our daughter turned 2 while we were here in Canberra. We just had a delightful time. And we've been back a couple of brief times. We've been to Australia 6 or 7 times since, but we still have very special, fond feelings for Canberra, even if it's not quite so chilly as it is recently. Anyway, tonight my topic is not about inequality, but about population trends, another subject that I work on. So let me get started, if I can. And the beginning, I'm going to be covering material that's familiar to almost all of you. So reviewing things, making sure we're on the same page before I talk about more recent population trends in China. And I'm not going to read every single line, but this tells you what you already know, that since 2022, China has been shrinking in terms of population. India is now the most populous country in the world. So here are the issues, a lot of issues to cover, and I'm only going to talk briefly about some of them. But what has been the trend in fertility? Why did China adopt a national one-child policy in 1980? And what were the justifications? And that's where the be careful what you wish for comes in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And what role did the one-child policy have in the decline in fertility in China over time? And then why did they end the policy since 2016? And why are there efforts to now try to reverse 180 degrees and saying now you should have more babies? They don't seem to be working. And why is that? And is the fact that China's number of births has been declining rather sharply in recent years, is this a crisis or is this actually a good thing for China? So now, assuming that not everybody in the room has read the 10-year-old article in the China Journal that I wrote with 2 demographer colleagues challenging myths about the one-child policy, I just want to go over these myths briefly today. True that China has a much larger population, but it's not because Mao Zedong consistently opposed any kind of efforts to limit births. It's also the fact that mandatory births implemented by the Communist Party did not begin in 1980, but began in 1970, while Mao was still alive. And most of the reduction in fertility in China from 1970 up to the present occurred before the one-child policy was launched. Okay, so the enforcement of the one-child policy was not the main driver of China's fertility decline, and it's ultra-low fertility today. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about trends in total fertility rates. So since not everybody in the audience is a demographer, the total fertility rate is not a statistic, it's a projection. What it is an estimate of if all of the women in the population had babies at the rate that they're currently doing, of different ages and different social backgrounds, at the end of their childbearing years, how many babies would they produce? And in order to have a stable population, the replacement level fertility is 2.1. Okay, so the question is, where did China start before the one-child policy, and where is it today? And here's a very famous quote from Mao. I'm not going to read this whole thing. You can read it. So this is a very booming endorsement of, it's not a problem. China can increase its population many times. But it's important to note the date, September 1949. This was a rejoinder of Mao to a statement made by then U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who essentially said, as the Chinese Communist Party was about to declare national victory, he basically said, well, don't worry too much because the Chinese Communists won't be able to feed their population. And Mao essentially said, that's not true. Okay? But this is not a consistent, this view that Mao expressed at this time is not the whole story. Here's another quote from Mao several years later, 1957. Okay? So you want to ponder that one and read it to yourself a moment. The government perhaps needs to have a special ministry. How about a ministry for birth control, or perhaps establishing a commission as part of the government to control the number of births that people have? Well, by this time, Mao was in a different position. He was not about to just take over the country. He was presiding over a government in the first 5-year plan that was in fact trying to feed the population. And he recognized how difficult the challenge was. So Mao was essentially all over the lot, back and forth. And we don't have as many clear statements, unfortunately, in his later years, close to his death, as we would like. But the fact of the matter is that mandatory birth limits began in 1970 under a policy called the later, longer, fewer policy. And this was while, obviously, Mao was still alive. So exactly what role he had and how much he was aware of it, Mao was already getting a little, out to seed in a few years before his death. But basically, there was an effort. There had been efforts to have not compulsory, but voluntary family planning campaigns starting in the 1950s. But they had never been very effective. In fact, there was almost an inverse relationship between when China was practicing voluntary family planning and what the actual trends in birth rates were, as I can show in a moment. But this was a dramatic change to say, now it's not voluntary. You are limited to marry later. The legal marriage age at this time was 18 for females and 20 for males. But essentially, if you were a rural resident, they tried to enforce, starting in 1970, that you couldn't marry if you're a woman until you were 23 and not till 25. And in the cities, basically 25 and 27. If you were going to have more than one birth, 4-year interval between births. And then at this time, urbanites were supposed to be limited to 2 births and rural people to 3. The State Family Planning Commission, which Mao mentioned in 1957, had already been created by 1964. And it began very vigorously enforcing this. So it had birth permits. You had to get permits to have another baby if they had to check how many babies you already had. They kept records on the contraceptive use of different women. They had menstrual monitoring, at least in urban areas. Women, grassroots family planning workers would go to women's homes and say, have you had your period yet, dearie? And trying to nip in the bud any woman that became pregnant who didn't have approval to have a birth and so forth. So a lot of the coercive tools of enforcing limits on births were already developed during the 1970s. And this was, incidentally, not a period of dramatically improved economic growth. So what happened in terms of the trend in fertility was mainly due to these coercive implementation of the later, longer, fewer campaign. And during this period, it was quite effective, as I've already indicated. Here's this chart doesn't take us up to the present. It's only up to the beginning of the new millennium, and I'll show it a couple of different times. But you can see this is the total fertility rate in. Basically, the average woman was having close to 6 children until the famine, and then it cratered at close to 3. But then there was this huge recovery after the Great Leap Forward to more than 7. But then the 1970s is when this is that dramatic decline that I've already referred to. So from roughly 5.8 down to 2.7 or so. Okay, now, as I'll mention in a moment, when the one-child policy was adopted, you didn't have a further decline immediately. The further decline occurred only at the end of the decade. Okay, so this blue line is replacement level fertility, 2.1. So China in the early 1990s finally gets to replacement level fertility and below. So why did the one-child policy, if they were already doing so well, reducing the birth rate, why did they launch the one-child policy? Well, it's a complicated story, and I don't have the minutes of the Politburo meetings, so I can't swear exactly what was going on. But the leadership of the Communist Party decided they'd been doing so well in reducing the birth rate that they wanted to make an even tighter drop in the number of births. And in order to do that, they would have to limit families to 1 birth. Another factor was the fact that this previous baby boom in the early 1960s, in the 1980s, those babies were going to start having babies. So there was some demographers arguing, at least for a few years, we have to have a one-child policy because we have these, this fluky, huge upsurge of births, and these people are going to start having babies. Okay, so the Chinese Communist Party leadership decided already in 1978-79 that they were going to experiment with and then launch a national one-child policy. Okay, but what happened then was that there was also a group of demographers that was debating and going to give advice to the Chinese leadership, and a man by the name of Sun Jian basically took over the group. Sun Jian was a very powerful, politically connected head of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, a member of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, but he was also a rocket scientist. So he had computers, and it turns out computer rocket telemetry and population trends, the math is pretty much the same. And the rest of the demographers, they only had, I don't think they were restricted to abacuses. I think they had hand calculators, but they couldn't do the kind of projections he did. So he could put in a number and say, okay, if every family has 1 child, 1.2 children, and basically, but he also had already traveled in Europe, and he met and was very much influenced by these neo-Malthusians who were operating in Europe then. And you're not old enough to remember, most of you, but there was this huge, there was Paul Ehrlich, a Stanford professor, published a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb. And basically the Malthusian argument, Malthus was this economist way back in the 18th century, wasn't it? Anyway, he said that there's an inevitable tendency that increases in food can only increase arithmetically, but population can increase geometrically. And so there's going to be constantly famines and so forth. So for whatever reason, he was influenced by this, and he determined that China's ideal population a century into the future would be under 700 million. Well, at the time, China had almost 1 billion people. So this is the be careful what you wish for. He was not simply saying we should reduce the rate of population growth. We should aim over a century to make China have a smaller population than it even has currently. Okay, so basically he provided a kind of pseudoscientific, I would call it quackery, justification for the one-child policy that the Communist Party had already decided to launch. And other demographers, part of his group, who didn't have computers the way he did, they objected and said this was going to cause kind of resistance and cause family harm and everything, and they were brushed aside. This is Mr. Sung Jen. So far as I know, he's still alive. He's, I think, 93 now. And basically he kept, even though he had retired long ago, for many, many years, he kept being a very influential voice, arguing that China needed to maintain its one-child policy. Here's one of the propaganda posters of the period. For the 4 modernizations, a couple should only give birth to 1 child. And many foreigners also became convinced by what was going on in China. This is a British publication, and basically Diane Francis, whoever she is, said, other countries should also adopt a one-child policy the way China did. Well, anyway, what were the actual fertility trends? As I've already shown in the chart, fertility didn't go down initially after the one-child policy was. The reasons for that I won't go into now, but I can in Q&A if there's time. But it wasn't until the early 1990s that China reached replacement level fertility and below. And then it generally stabilized in more recent years while the one-child policy was still in effect between 1.4 to 1.6, which, anybody know what Australia's total fertility rate is currently? I believe it's about 1.5. The American rate is about 1.6. So China, being a much poorer, still predominantly agrarian country, nonetheless had achieved a low fertility rate, below replacement fertility. But of course, China, unlike the US and Australia, well, the US before we had the current leader in the US, had the immigration to add more to the population, even if the fertility rate was low. So, in fact, in the period after the one-child policy was launched, the main driver of the further fertility decline was China's rapid economic development, rapid urbanization, rapid increase in education, and so forth. All of these modern trends that drive fertility down in other countries, and that had done so in other East Asian countries without a coercive control on the number of births in Japan or Taiwan or South Korea. All of them had already reached ultra-low fertility rates, and China was on the way there. So this again is showing the trend, the same chart that I showed earlier. So what about recent times? This is estimates, TFR, total fertility rate estimates for 2022. The champion in the world in recent years is South Korea, under 0.8. So the average woman in South Korea these days is having less than 1 baby, okay? But the PRC is actually, in this estimate, below Taiwan and Japan, only a little bit, but still somewhat below. So mandatory birth limits had actually continued for 45 years, if you count the later, longer, fewer limits. The one-child limit for 35 years. But starting early in the new millennium, a group of about 24 Chinese demographers, some of them based in the West, about half of them based in China, started holding regular meetings and research and writing position papers trying to get the leaders of China to end the one-child policy. And they sent 2 appeals up to the Chinese Communist Party leadership in 2004 and 2009, and both of those were turned away. And I'm told by one of my co-authors who was part of this group that Sung Jen came out of retirement to stamp up and down and said, no, you cannot end the one-child policy. We need it to get to our eventual goal. But the third appeal in 2015, I don't know whether he stayed home or he was sick, or but anyway, in 2015, in October, they announced that they were going to end the one-child policy starting in January 1st, 2016. So as of January 1st, all Chinese are now allowed to have 2 children. Starting in 2021, this was raised to all allowed to have 3 children. But when this was announced, there was a lot of derision. You know, it says, people are not having 2 children. Why are you encouraging them to have 3 children? It doesn't make any sense. But in almost every year after 2016, there have been fewer births than the year before. So the population is, the number of births has been going down more sharply since the one-child policy was ended than before it was ended. And the lowest rate was in 2023. There were only 9 million births, the fewest ever, barely more than half the 2016 total of almost 18 million. In 2024, last year, there was a slight rebound in births to 9.54, and speculation about why, but most people don't think it was due to somehow the Chinese Communist Party now having encouraging people to have more births. It may have more to do with a dragon year and the fact that people are no longer so worried about the effects of the pandemic lockdowns and everything. But even though there was slightly increase in number of births, the population continued to decline last year, only slightly. So all of this shows, I assume you're already convinced by now, that the one-child policy was not the main factor in driving down the number of births in China. And when it was eliminated, the number of births went down even further. Here's a chart. Doesn't show the last 23, 24 because I haven't updated this slide, but you can see during the final years of the one-child policy up to 2015, 2016, there were 15, 16, 17 million births, and now you're down to 9 plus. So the Chinese Communist Party has been doing lots of things to try to encourage people to have more births. So they're increasing paid maternity leave, giving cash bonuses for second and third births. And just in the last month or so, China has announced a national policy of, I think it's something like the equivalent of $500 per child per year, up to age 3, to try to encourage births, extending wedding leave, guaranteed placement in expanded preschools. Some provinces have announced the end of all birth limits, and I don't know if it's still the case, but a few years ago, Sichuan announced that they would even encourage unwed women to have babies, which goes against the policy of most parts of China. And there's also some efforts to discourage abortions and to discourage divorce. And here's a change in the propaganda imagery. This is along the Yangtze River in Wuhan. This is now another happy family, this time with 3 children. Of course, you wouldn't be happy enough if you only had 1 child, so you want to have 3 children. And this is obviously a very prosperous middle-class family. It must be because they had 3 children. So what can we say about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of these birth incentives? So far, there's no real convincing sign that these birth incentives are reversing China's trend toward declining fertility. And partly, China is ignoring the fact that lots of these other countries that have had the same experience without coercive family planning have been trying desperately. South Korea has a whole bunch of policies on the book, and incentives and payments and so forth, but they don't seem to be working, okay? I mean, or I mean, there's some arguments that maybe Sweden or maybe France have, nudged the birth rate up a little, whatever, but there don't seem to be any countries that have figured out how to get people to have more babies. It's much easier to get people to have fewer babies. So all of this means that some people are now projecting that Sun Jian will eventually get his wish. Not before he's dead, of course. We don't expect him to live all that much longer, but China's population is expected by the United Nations and various other experts to fall below 700 million by, if not by 2080, which was Sun Jian's original target, but maybe by early in the next century. So, but Xi Jinping nonetheless keeps saying, well, we're gonna get people to have more babies. We're gonna make it a marriage and childbirth society. So this is just repeating things that I've just said already. But the consequence of my argument is obviously that China, that putting a lot of money and effort into trying to get people to have more babies is wasteful and ineffective. And China would be far better off to try to think of policies to make its population more productive and have better human capital and so forth, and to reduce inequality and reduce gender inequality and so forth, instead of trying to, and obviously one of the implications of trying to raise the birth rate and women having 3 babies or more is lots of feminists in China and abroad are worried. What does that mean for gender equality in China when the government is trying to get women to have more babies and marry and stay home or whatever? So is population decline, is it a crisis? Here are just some selective advantages, which are pretty obvious. If you have fewer people, you generate less pollution, less crowding. It's easier to feed, house, and educate smaller birth cohorts. But the problem is not just the size of the population. It has to do particularly with the distribution and the fact that China, as a result of its not just the one-child policy, but its very rapid economic development, is now aging more rapidly than other societies. So China is growing old before getting rich, and China is already having to cope with, and will have even more to cope with, the issue about how do you provide support and social connections and everything for the increasingly numerous older population. My recently deceased Harvard colleague, Bill Overholt, gave this quote in one article he wrote, that Japan shows what an extraordinary burden a graying society can be. China's graying policy problem is worse. The number of new entrants to the labor force has been declining since about 2010. So the number of people entering the labor force and producing and paying into pension funds and taxes and so forth to support the elderly is endangered. And there are already lots of articles about the pension funds running out of money in China by 2035 or something. I don't know. Maybe Christine or other people can tell me whether these are realistic estimates or not. And it's also the question about the social connections for elderly people. Lots of old people, instead of having multiple grown children and relatives, now have one child. Here's a cartoon from a few years ago, the so-called 4-2-1 family, the result of the demographic trends over the years. So this poor kid at the bottom has got a large burden. These are some slides that my colleague Wang Feng prepared for a talk he gave on this that I stole from him. So and I won't go into it in detail, but the chart on the left shows the dependency ratio. So China, early in its reforms, enjoyed a demographic dividend, so that yellow curve went down. So there were lots more people joining the labor force and contributing economically compared to both the number of young people who had not yet entered the labor force and the number of older people who've retired from the labor force. But now it's been going up steeply, and this chart is projecting up until 2050 about how much higher it will get. And the same thing, these two charts on the right are showing the dramatic changes in the population pyramid from a more normal population pyramid in 1982 census to 2000, and then projections for 2030 on the right. This is another, again, driving home the same point, that in earlier years there were more than 7 people working for every elderly person in China, and now it's projected to, it's already down to about 4 and going down even lower in the future. Here's another dramatic indication. One normally expects richer, more developed societies to also be older. But China is now an older society than the United States. The curve just passed. So I forget, 38 years old. 38 doesn't seem very old, it's pretty young to me, but nonetheless, the average age of the entire population in China is higher than the US and expanding. The Chinese social safety net, so this involves things like pensions and health care and so forth. It has been expanding. The government, to its credit, has pretty much since 2000 has been putting more and more money into social safety net programs and extending them, particularly from the favored urban population increasingly into the countryside, but it's still a very uneven system. And the rural people still are very disadvantaged compared to urban people. And this is a quote, again, from demographers Wang Feng and Tsai Yung, talking about trends and projections of government spending on education, healthcare, and pensions. They were already growing very substantially, and projection is how high they will have to get in order to meet the needs of the elderly in the future, and arguing that this trend is unsustainable. Okay, having to spend more than 30% of your gross domestic product if the benefits of China's social safety net programs were increased to be to the level of other societies doesn't seem possible. I mentioned it's not just the economic support for the elderly, but it's also about the social relations of the elderly population. I did a survey in 1994 in Baoding, Hebei, a sort of middle-sized city in China for complicated reasons. And it was a study of intergenerational relations in Chinese families. I think there's even a China Journal article that came out of this. But anyway, and we interviewed people with Baoding Hukou household registrations over age 50, and the average person had 3.1 grown children, and almost all of them were living nearby. This is in 1994. So these are people old enough to have completed their fertility before even the later Longer Fewer campaign. But as we've already talked about, in recent times in urban China, most elderly only have one grown child, and the one child may have moved to Shenzhen or somewhere more profitable rather than staying in Baoding. So, a few of the urban elderly, they'll even outlive their only child. So what does this do to the sort of social support and feeling of security of older people when they don't have multiple grown children that, okay, if this one is a deadbeat and doesn't contribute, at least I have these 2 other kids that can help out. So I didn't get a grant to go back to Baoding to do a new study, but my hypothesis is that older people are feeling a lot less secure in Baoding nowadays than they were in 1994, even though it's a much richer society. The standard of living has gone way up. Okay. So what kind of measures could China do that would help to sort of improve the human capital of the population improve the prospects for economic growth and so forth, and not be so threatening as the current trends are. They could raise the unusually young retirement ages, which they promised to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They could fundamentally change the taxation system in order to raise money to meet needs like spending on better rural education and so forth. And I don't have time to go into this, and this conference that's going to be held at CIW next week, Andy Walter has done all this work that shows China doesn't have a taxation system that redistributes income. It's less redistributive than the US or Russia or whatever. So the taxation system is mostly these value-added taxes and so forth. So the result so China, many people would argue, needs to change its taxation system to be able to redistribute income and to support better social safety net programs and so forth. A Chinese economist, Cai Fang, says, well, maybe there should be some further increase of agricultural mechanization to relieve rural labor to flow into the cities again. Maybe there should be major investments in old age collective facilities. Maybe there should be some better ways to combat gender inequality and so forth. So these are all things that have been discussed. But as I already mentioned, the tax system is not redistributive. There's no property tax on housing. There's no inheritance tax. There's no capital gains tax. For more than 2 decades, they've been promising introducing property taxes. But given the problems in the housing market and the property sector, that seems very likely to happen at any time soon. The retirement age question is a very bizarre situation. China's retirement age regulations up to the present come from Stalin's Soviet Union. And that's why China has this bizarre system in which they're both not only earlier than in other societies, but gender differentiated. So China says it's in favor of gender equality, but women in manual labor jobs are supposed to retire at age 50. And in mental labor jobs at 55, but men don't have to retire until 60. So all of those are very young, but gender differentiated. Well, the reason they're doing that is because Stalin in the Soviet Union decided we need to have the older women drop out of the workforce and go home and care for the babies and do the shopping and cooking so the younger women can have 90% plus labor force participation rates. And China followed that, and China split from the Soviet Union in 1960. But it's only this year that China is now proposing to start raising the retirement ages, but very gradually over 15 years, and they still, I think, at the end will be lower than most other societies. The paper that I'm giving at the CIW panel next week talks about this rural educational deficit, which Scott Rosell, my collaborator, has written about extensively. But China needs to do much more to enhance the educational opportunities for rural hukou youths in China. And rural hukou youths in China are still the majority of all youths. China is now over 60% urban, but that includes migrants who don't have urban hukou, okay? And their kids are very still multiply disadvantaged in terms of the educations they can get. So but they would need a lot of funding to provide more schooling and more teachers and so forth. So in general, China has not done all that much. And China, in my view, cannot avoid further long-term population decline. The efforts to boost the birth rate will not work, at least not more than marginally. and they would be better advised to take these steps to improve the welfare and human capital of the population that they do have, and also combating gender inequality and reducing family insecurity, so spreading the social safety net. The pensions is the most out of kilter. There's over 20%, an urban employee in a state sector or a state company gets a pension after they retire that's 20% as high as or more as the modest pensions that are now available for people in the countryside. So while it seems to me China could avoid having a major economic crisis because of its population trends, I don't see enough evidence the Chinese leaders are introducing the kinds of structural reforms and redistribution measures and so forth that would be necessary in order not for it to become a serious crisis in the future. So on that pessimistic note, I will conclude. Thank you.